Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the head springs of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. Strictly speaking, C.S. Lewis never wrote a time travel story, but he certainly spent a lot of time writing about the concept of time and how strange it is that we inhabit it. For instance, in Mere Christianity, Lewis writes this: God, I believe, does not live in a time series at all. His life is not dribbled out moment by moment like ours. With him, it is, so to speak, still 1920 and already 1960. For his life is himself. Lewis, of course, got this idea from St. Augustine, who was one of the first to suggest that God is outside of time. But if time is not part of God's essential reality, if it is created, then why do we live in it? What's the benefit or blessing God intended by placing us in this most mysterious but constant source of limitation and opportunity? Today, I welcome someone whose answers to these questions intrigued me so much that I wanted to share them with my listeners. He recently spoke on this topic at the Anselm Society's 2022 Imagination Redeemed Conference. Matthew Clark is a singer, songwriter, and storyteller from Mississippi. He hosts a weekly podcast, 1,000 Words, Stories on the Way, featuring essays reflecting on faith-keeping. Matthew travels to share his songs and stories, and my impression is that his art serves as an invitation to think as well as to feel very deeply. Matthew, welcome to Upstream.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, the old saying is that fish don't know they're wet. And we rarely think about the fact that we are in time, that our life is progressing second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour. Help us to understand the strangeness of time. Help us to see it for the first time.
Well, I think time, in some sense, it ought to be stranger than it is, because we have gotten to a point where our way of being in the world is so colored and flavored by the technology that we have come up with, that I think we probably have, in some sense, a false sense that we actually control time, because we can wear it on, we can sort of capture it in a little capsule that we can strap to our wrist, or we can, or we used to do that. We have it in our pockets now, right? And one of my favorite authors that I've been reading the last year is a guy named Erazim Kohak. He's a Czech philosopher, and he says we have these constructs, these time constructs, and they give us the illusion that time is something that we have sort of tamed or controlled. And he says, but that's not only an unfortunate mistake, it's also something that makes time less beautiful than it is. It's something that has made us forget that time is a gift from God.
It was Kelly Kapick's book, You're Only Human, that talked about time in one of the chapters. And he draws attention to time as this limitation that we, like you said, think we can control, but all we're doing is measuring it. And we're measuring it in ever more precise interval or increments, I should say, so that, we think we can control every moment of our day to be everywhere, do everything, and accomplish every task that we set out to do just because we've got a watch or we've got a phone or we know what time all these things are supposed to happen. But in reality, what we're doing is cutting the same pie up into ever smaller slices. And the pie is not really our time, it's us, right? It's our attention, it's our being, our love for things in the world. It's all of this is sort of experienced as a sacrifice. And it's not necessarily bad, but we have to be conscious of the fact that we're doing this to ourselves and we're not living like our ancestors lived with regards to time.
Yeah, it makes me think of two things. One thing is how the devices that we have allow us to do so many things, while at the same time, we're kind of getting more and more enmeshed into these things. And we're only just beginning with books. Like, a lot of people are beginning to write about how to set boundaries with technology, like Andy Crouch, The Life We're Looking For. So we're beginning to understand how these things that give us, that we feel like are breaking down our limitations, are actually placing a different kind of limitation on us, in some ways enslaving us. The other thing that makes me think about is a conversation I had with a friend of mine about how centuries ago you might have had a town clock. And so you would hear the bell ring And that would give you a sense of, well, it's midday, but you already knew that because you're outside and you're farming and you're aware.
The phrase someone used with me recently was seasons of the day. They didn't have time. They had seasons of the day.
Right. And you could feel that without a clock, and you still can. But the culture in America developed right alongside the development of personal timepieces. So you could have a pocket watch. And so our culture developed as a very time conscious culture. And I have a friend from Trinidad, and we always joke that she's on Trini time, and so you have cultures around the world who may have a different sense of time or how important it is to stick to the clock, or
Dr. Kapik actually talks about Africa time in his book.
Yeah. And so we've become so dependent or captivated by the devices that we're forgetting what time actually is. And it's not your watch and it's not your clock. It's actually something other than that.
We're going to get to the theological import of time in a moment, because that's really the heart of your talk from the Imagination Redeemed conference. But you made another remark that I felt was intriguing and potentially revealing. You talked about all the time travel stories that we tell. So Lewis obviously did not write a time travel fiction, but he, like I said, talked a lot about time. And you say that these time travel movies and books, so Doctor Who and Back to the Future, and I guess Terminator qualifies, they provide an entertaining setting in which to understand two human traits. And you said those traits are vulnerability and regret. What did you mean by that? And could you kind of give us some examples?
Well, it was something I love about how God has made us is that we can imagine things that are not there. Monster stories are this way. I was thinking about Jekyll and Hyde, how everybody has this experience of sometimes we do things and we feel like it wasn't us. We feel like we turned into a monster and woke up in the middle of the woods and we're like, how did I get here? And so like a story like that is an externalization of the human experience. Monster stories are. But so are time stories. We have this sense of, oh, if I could just go back, what would I change? And so that's about regret. And regret is ultimately addressed by forgiveness. Right? God has provided for regret to be properly addressed by mercy and grace and atonement. And so we don't have to travel to the past, but we do always, it's interesting to have a genre of literature that allows us, or filmmaking or art, that allows us to explore those feelings of regret in the human condition. And likewise, traveling to the future, I think we're always wondering, how can I mitigate vulnerability? Living in trusting relationships with other broken people is scary. So I want to explore narratively and imagine how I might mitigate risk.
That tells us a lot about our relationship with time, just in terms of our own experience, right? That's what we know about ourselves, and those stories give us an opportunity to explore it. So you call Scripture itself a kind of time travel story. More precisely, you say it's a record of God's faithfulness. Time travel is the antidote, in this case, to fear of the future, and that the time travel we're doing is going back into the past and looking at God's record of faithfulness to us. Help us understand, if you would, the scriptural witness to time, what it's for, how God has used it, and how traveling back through scriptural time can instruct us and lead us to greater trust and faith.
Dennis Kinlaw and John Oswalt, there's a book called Lectures in Old Testament Theology that I was reading through. They were talking about how the Hebrews were among the first, maybe the first, to really take history seriously. And in the ancient Near East, in the ancient world, the predominant way of imagining or understanding history was cyclical. The snake is eating its tail, and nothing ever changes. You're trapped. And so Plato and these other thinkers, their way of seeing time and themselves within time was really despairing. And the best you could hope for was maybe somehow you die and you maybe will be able to escape time. rather than the Hebrew perspective, which this developed, I'm sure, but they saw that God was making and keeping promises, and that the making of keeping of promises was something that unfolded within the medium of time. And so they started writing down these stories of how God had made a promise to a man named Abraham. And look, let's see what happens to that promise. Where does it go? And it develops, but it doesn't just develop once, it develops repeatedly. And in some sense, it expands, and the promise becomes bigger and bigger than you ever thought. So a promise for Isaac to arrive turns into this promise, this nation is now developing. And now as this nation develops, it gets a king. And then that promise is expanded to David and to the messianic promises. And then that widens and deepens even more. And you have Jesus showing up. And so you've got this very, very different and much more hopeful and beautiful view of history and of time, which has God constantly developing and making a more capacious hope and future as he's going. But it's slow because he's dealing with real people in a real creation. And so looking back over that, the more we become aware of those stories, the more we learn how dependable God is, that he's a promise-keeping God. And he understands that these promises take time to develop and mature.
That's so interesting, Matthew, because it seems to me we have moved beyond Christianity as a culture, and yet we haven't moved beyond a Christian or Hebrew view of time. And so what I mean by that is we haven't gotten back to a cyclical view of time like the pre-Christian pagans had, like the Eastern civilizations had, like the Greeks had, like the folks in Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time have. It's we still have this linear conception of time, even in a secular culture. But the problem is, without that time travel, if you will, through the history of God's faithfulness and all his kept promises to his people, or without God himself even being on the timeline, the linear nature of time becomes very bleak and hopeless. So you see people talk about how the earth itself is fatally compromised environmentally. The future we have to look forward to is a very bleak and climatically chaotic one, right? If you zoom out and look at an even broader perspective, have you ever seen one of those YouTube videos where it's like on the astronomy channels where they go through and they fast forward time billions and billions of years to how our universe is going to unravel and finally die a heat death in cold nothingness. And it's just like, here's what you have to look forward to. And it's a linear conception, right? Because they're not starting over again. It's just, that's how it goes from A to B, and then it's over. But the conspicuous hopelessness of a linear timeline without God is very interesting to me. I wonder, what do you think is going to happen? Are we going to eventually, barring some sort of great revival, which, please, Lord, but are we going to sort of revert to the cyclical view of things, or are we just going to keep on in a secular, hopeless, linear timeline? What does that look like?
Well, that's interesting because I think the idea of progress has taken hold of the imagination since modernity, right? The idea that humans are going to make things better and better and better. But I think, too, that in some sense that has not been adequate over time to sustain the imagination in a hopeful way. Kohak, again, that same guy, in his book called The Embers and the Stars, he's from, Eastern Europe. And so he's talking about a lot of the Russian imagination or the Soviet imagination. And he says, ultimately, it worked for a little while to kind of capture the imagination, but eventually it kind of wore off because the thing you hoped for, the utopia you hoped for, was always out of reach. It was always for the next generation. And you're working for something that you don't expect to enjoy. But even the word utopia literally means nowhere. It's no place. Yeah. And so it's an ideal, but it's not really something you can sink your teeth into. Whereas what God is saying is new things can happen, that the system is not closed in that sense. And you see this with Jesus's incarnation. Something crazy happens that nobody saw coming. No one could have predicted on a sort of YouTube linear time lapse, right? Like, no, that wouldn't have shown up on that simulation. It wouldn't have factored in. They wouldn't have known how to factor that in. So, but God is like that. God is full of surprises. He has made a creation that he has allowed separateness and otherness from himself. In other words, we're not pantheists or pagans. The gods don't come from within the creation. We are supernaturalists. We are ones who believe that God has made a creation that is other than himself, right? So he can enjoy it, he can interact with it, but he is not it. But he can also enter into it, and he has. And so there are always these new variables that we may not expect, but God can do things in his creation. He has entered into it. And so whatever trajectory we might map out on a computer is never going to be adequate, because you can't factor in the things that God may have in mind to do within his creation.
We experience time as this force of decay and this force of dislocation. So I recently sort of had the experience of watching my childhood home torn down, because, we moved out of this years and years ago, but it's always been there still. Someone's been living in it. And then I heard, because my aunt lives next door, I heard that it was going to be torn down. So I said, "Is it down yet?" And she said, no, it's like scheduled for tomorrow. So I took two of my kids out there and we pulled up, and the place had just been knocked down. She had missed the day. It was knocked down, but we walked around the yard because of the old place set my dad built was still up. The swings were still kind of hanging from the tree, all old and dilapidated, but they were still there. All the familiar, scenery was there, and all that was kind of scheduled to be demolished as well, and it was. But I just got to thinking of how time inevitably expunges the world of the things that you remember and know, and the change is so absolute that ultimately the world is going to become a place that you don't recognize. And that's the sort of godless secular view of time, that that process is going to continue. Ultimately, it's going to erase you yourself from the story, and it marches on. That's what it does. But you actually claim that time is part of the original good creation. This is not a result of the fall, right? Now, the decay that it brings is, in a sense, but time itself is a gift, and God was giving us a gift when he made time and placed us in it. What does that gift look like? What do you think God intended for us as creatures that live in time? What was he trying to give us?
On one level, he was giving us a classroom for personhood. He was building a sort of graduated program that would draw us up slowly into the life of the Trinity. Part of what really gets in the way of that for us is how death has taken over our imagination, and we see time as a problem because we're always feeling this sense of, I'm running out of time. And we see death as this sort of brick wall that we're just going to slam up against. But that feels so wrong. It feels like, but I don't have enough time. I should have more time to love my family and my friends and to get better at guitar or learn jazz piano or something. And I think that intuition is correct. It really is wrong. What we were made for ultimately is to be with and to be like Jesus, to be wedded to the Trinity, to be drawn up into that everlasting joy and that constant flow and dance of their love. But I think that we were made in a way where God intended to grow us towards that point. And maybe even that point is ever receding, right? Because you don't ever get finished with God. There's always further up. There's always further in. And so we're on I think a trajectory of growth. I kind of think even the scene where Adam is naming the animals, I don't think that's a pretend scene. I think Adam is learning something about his environment and what is the right relationship to these creatures. What kind of thing am I? What kind of thing are they? and he's peering into the essay, right, the essence of each thing, so that he can perceive God's intention, and he can perceive each thing's telos. But he has to learn that, and that's prior to the fall. So there's education happening, there's development and promise already present that is going to take time. And God has built this world that way, and that's a good thing. And now that death has been removed as a problem, as a serious barrier, we're back on track to that destination that he had in mind for us.
You said time is God's experience of himself, or I think you're quoting someone there in the talk. And then you just said something else that was interesting, which is that there is a dance of mutual love, in a way, between the persons of the Trinity, into which God is inviting us, and that time is his instrument for doing that. Could you kind of explain how you imagine that working?
Yeah, so there's the old term, the perichoresis, which is the dance of Trinity.
Like mutual indwelling, I think, is the
mutual indwelling, co-inherence, yeah. But, if God wants to build a bigger family and invite them into that, well, then we got to learn some moves. I'm not very good at dancing, so I need some. It's going to take a little time for me to learn the Virginia reel, or to learn the whatever it is. It's probably a pretty complicated dance. So I think that this beautiful thing is going on at the center of reality, or is the center of reality, and we are being called forward into that, like Peter says, to participate in the divine nature, to be wedded to the Godhead through the Son. That is our destination. That's God's dream for humanity. When he made us, that's what he wanted for us. He is always working through real, stubborn, choice-making, rebellious people in a real fallen, broken, screwy world. He's working with all of those variables because he is all wise, and he is constantly weaving us back into and back towards that destination to be with and like Jesus.
Matthew, one of the other things that I thought was so great about your talk is that you draw on a lot of Scripture's own language and metaphors for how God uses time to bring about salvation and holiness and consummation. So, we could just go to Jesus and talk about his use of leaven working its way through a lump, or a crop that ripens over time, or grapes that ferment in a wineskin. And you need a new wineskin so it can stretch. You can't use an old wineskin, it'll burst. Or Paul talking about gestation in Romans 8. He uses the metaphor of gestation as a way of describing our experience in this world. Like, we're groaning, there's difficulty, we're being born in a sense, and there's something happening. Do we pay close enough attention to these scriptural uses of time language? And if not, what do you think we're missing there? What could we learn by carefully reflecting again on the time metaphors of the New Testament?
Well, I think you're making a great point, because God has supplied us really richly with a lot of built-in imagery and metaphors and sort of little tracks for our imaginations to run in. So he's not left us clueless, but I think a lot of time a lot of dust has gotten on top of the clues. A friend of mine said one of our main jobs is, you have like a glass top table and it's got a treasure map under it, but the table is so dusty that you don't see the treasure map. And the job of the Christian is to slide your hand across the dust and wipe it away and say, have you seen this treasure map under here? There's all this wonderful stuff. And I'm thinking too of George MacDonald. He wrote an essay called The Imagination and Its Functions. And he talks about how the world that God has given us is this rich resource of the human soul sort of externalized. And so when you find metaphors for your experience in the creation, that's not an accident. God has actually built the world that way to correspond to your inner life and the life of the Spirit. And so when you run across something like, it's like we're gestating, it's like, well, yeah, it is. It is actually, because that's not a forced metaphor. It's actually, there's a real connection there that God thought of, and he put it in his creation. And so I do think that going back to what Kohak said about mistaking the construct for the real thing, mistaking the watch as if that was actually what time is, I think we do a lot of that. We've gotten into a place where I think post-industrialism, modernism, materialism, reductionism, we're in this place where our imaginations are kind of depleted of a lot of the natural resources of what God put there and gave us to help us get a grip on these kinds of things and imagine them, because we're mistaking the sheet music for the symphony. And we've become just content with the sort of mechanism or the technology, and it's actually blocking our view from those resources that God has given us. And the scripture is a major resource, right? And a lot of these images and narratives that can become furniture in our minds to help us think about our situation, they're not out of reach, but we're not reaching for them, or we're not reaching deeply into them.
I just did a sort of series, a couple of interviews with authors who have written about limits, and Capek was, of course, one of them. The other one was Ashley Hales, who wrote A Spacious Life. And one of the themes that kind of emerged out of those two interviews was that the limits God places on us are not impositions. They're actually gifts. They're something of what it means to be a creature. And by making us limited, he's actually giving us the ability to become things we could not have otherwise become. And time was one of those key limitations. If you think about time as being trapped in a sequence and just only being able to live one moment at a time and taking a long time to become the things you want to become, and you can't just like in the Matrix where you like download the ability to play the piano or speak another language or something. You actually have to invest time. It really is like putting grape juice in a skin and letting it ferment before you get wine. You don't get the good result until you've put time into it. But what if that's actually extraordinarily beautiful and empowering? What if it does something for us that we couldn't otherwise have received? In other words, maybe God didn't impose this process on us. Maybe this is just the only way to get the good gifts at the end of it. And the reason I say this, Matthew, is because God himself subjected himself to time. And you bring this up in the talk, that Jesus did not pop into existence on the earth in a sort of ready adult state as the, miracle working teacher who could preach a couple of sermons and then on Friday go and die for our sins, which I guess you could have done it. He could have done it that way, but he didn't. He subjected himself to this long, drawn out, decades stretched process that we all go through called being a human and growing up. Help us to rethink this, if you would, the gifts that we get out of being not stuck in time, but being given this medium. What are we getting or aiming for? What is God allowing us to achieve that we could not have achieved or received without it?
Experience in the arts. I think the arts have a lot of resources to help us with this. Jeremy Begbie is a great resource. He writes a lot about thinking through the arts. If you get into like a craft, what you find is I've done some woodworking, and I'm a songwriter, and I enjoy writing. And it's not that I wish I could just snap my fingers and this song would show up. It's like I actually enjoy the process.
How unfulfilling would that be?
Right. It's like, I don't want to skip that. I don't want to skip the part where I have to sand the wood for 30 minutes and before I can stain it or cut it. Or I like laying in bed at night and just dreaming of how the things are going to fit together and it's going to make the piece or whatever, And so I think there's so much joy in processes. That's part of why people get so into a craft. is because, people talk about it being therapeutic or cathartic or whatever, but there's something to that because we are made to enjoy things deeply and to enter deeply into things. But if you are living in a culture like ours that is obsessed with efficiency and productivity and moving things along, then you don't have time to go deeply into anything. You got to just constantly be bouncing off the surface. And that goes for people too. The greatest craft you could ever enter into would be just being a person with another person and learning to look at their face and receive their presence and give your own presence, to listen well. That is really hard to do. It's hard to sit still with somebody. But what a beautiful thing. What a beautiful gift. And so I think before the fall, humans had needs. We were not needless creatures. It is not good for a man to be alone, for a human to be alone. And that's prior to the fall. I experienced this personally because I grew up learning to do everything by myself because there was some chaos in my home, and that left me kind of on my own a lot of the time. And in some ways too, that was really good because my parents just were like, "Go play in the woods all day. We're not that worried. You'll be fine." And that was the time. I lived on 25 acres, so it was okay.
Oh yeah, that's where the best stuff happens.
Yeah, and so I'm building forts and whatnot, climbing trees. But I learned to do things on my own, but I feel like what God has been teaching me the last 10 years especially has been how to collaborate. I'm learning how to collaborate and how to need other people. But for a long time, I felt like there was something wrong with me because I needed other people. And I was trying to kind of suppress that need and no, I should be able to do it all. It's been a really wonderful gift for God to redeem that and to bring me back. Because what I realize is if I can do everything myself, then I miss out on a whole world of the joy of being in relationship with other people. All that even a craft like songwriting or recording music can become if you let other people into that process. You get their gifts and their ideas. And like if I make a song by myself, honestly, it's kind of boring because none of the ideas surprise me. But if I collaborate with other musicians, suddenly the song becomes so much more than I ever could have made it. The capacities increase and they're filled by all these other people. But my need is what drives me into community and makes isolation unsatisfying. And what a gift that is. And I think time is that way too. Time has these limitations, but they draw us out into community and into the presence of others.
Matthew, you're a musician, so that places you in the same boat with my wife, who's a music major, and she's taught piano for a good long while. We've got 4 kids, so it's a little difficult for her to do that in this season, but she's looking forward to getting back to that eventually.
She's orchestrating a home.
Yes, exactly. She's got a whole orchestra here, and they're very noisy. It's like that beginning part where they're tuning the instruments, and they just, it takes a minute for the music to start. We're still waiting for the music to start in the Morris household, but point is that you two have something that I don't by training. I just love listening to music, and I took piano lessons and stuff, but the relationship between music and time has always fascinated me. And I actually had a conversation recently on Upstream with Nathan Johnson, who gave a talk at a conference I was at about the 7 liberal arts. And one of the quadrivium is music. And you say, well, that's odd. Why is music in this sort of classical scheme for educating? Isn't that just like an extracurricular? But the ancients and medieval Christians saw music as integral to a student's education because music is number in time. So that's how he explained it. There's an intimate relationship between music and time. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that relationship and then the potential of music to serve as a sort of pedagogy tool for learning how time affects us and how to navigate it, and maybe even how to bring beauty out of mistakes and trials?
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. I mean, you go way back to like Pythagoras and Boethius and those guys who were kind of constructing what would become this sort of medieval imagination about the world is sort of, in some sense, founded harmonically and musically. That the planets, right? You've got the planets that are
music of the spheres.
The music of the spheres, yeah. And Lewis was really all about that. Lewis being a medievalist, C.S. Lewis. So there is this sense, and I think this connects now to a lot of people are recovering. Hans Boersma's writing about heavenly participation. A lot of people are recovering the sacramental ontology, that the world is more than it is, and that God is always calling us not just to see the beam, but to see along the beam, as Lewis writes in A Meditation in a Tool Shed. And he says, you don't want to just stay your eye on glass, but you want to let it pass through the glass, and then the heavens espy. That's a George Herbert thing. That there's this transcendence that is not unattainable. It is actually making itself available to us through this world. And music is one of those things. I mentioned earlier that you wouldn't want to settle for the sheet music. You want to hear the actual symphony, right? And reductionism and materialism is kind of like turning the world into just sheet music, just material, and saying there really isn't any symphony. Sheet music is all there is. And I feel like that's the kind of approach we have to the world now, is that like, oh, it's just material. It doesn't actually participate in a grand symphony of reality, and at the center of which is the great dance of the Trinity. That's not real. That's, those old, outdated medievalists, that's what they thought, but they were idiots. We know better now. It's just, everything's just chemicals and atoms randomly bouncing off each other and generating what seems to be meaning, and that's just silly. So as we're recovering that sense of what is really going on here, what are we actually a part of? And it's something like this music. And music is something that exists apart from sheet music, apart from my writing. It's something that's just there. It's real. Just like math, we've come up with ways
we didn't make it up. We discovered it.
Right. We're observing something and we're codifying it. We're coming up with ways to talk about something that is there. But we didn't actually come up with the thing. And the trouble that Kohak is saying about the constructs is when you begin to think that your notation is the actual thing, rather than your notation is just a way of talking about something that is really beyond you and that you did not invent. That is a little window. Music, in that sense, is a little window into what is really going on here. What kind of world are we actually in? And it is a world that is swimming in transcendence, that really is, like Hopkins said, charged with the grandeur. And he has that sort of double meaning, where it is charged in the sense that it is filled with and sort of... but it is also charged in the sense that it's calling for a response. There's a responsibility to listen and attend to and rightly respond to God as he is revealing himself through the things he's made, and ultimately through the incarnation, but through everything he's made.
Music is in many ways a process, and it unfolds necessarily across time. Like we don't have a conception of what music would be like in the odd intra experience of God, right? What would music be like for a timeless being? That's a question that's probably too mysterious for us ever to answer. But we are in time beings, right? And we'll always inhabit something that's analogous to time, whether that's, I think it was Aquinas who came up with the aviternity idea, that eventually will inhabit something that's analogous to eternity, but not eternity itself, since we all had beginnings. So we'll kind of be like the angels, but we're still unfolding in eternity across this series. So that means that time is integral to the form of art that we know as music, which to me says that music teaches us a lot about process itself. And one of those aspects of process that unfolds in a fallen world is redemption. And as we talk about that, I can't help but think how music itself, and I know Begbie does this, so I look forward to that conversation because he has so many mind-blowing insights, but how music itself can create a sort of symbolic tension or fall and then resolve that in a way that actually resonates with mathematical principles, right? Like, you know what the resolution is going to feel and sound like because you know the principles intuitively, just as a person and as an ear shaped by Western music to some extent. But I think those things are intrinsic. Western music didn't make that stuff up. We didn't make up the rules of the intervals and the chords and the keys and all that stuff. It really is there in the harmonics, in the wavelengths and so forth. And the thing I want to get to, and I think we're beginning to synthesize here, juice out of the conversation, is that the key contribution that time makes to that process, specifically with redemption. So the beginning of the Silmarillion, as anyone who's read it knows, centers on music. Music creates the world. The angels create the world with music, under the conductorship of Iluvatar, Eru, God. And evil gets woven into the story as discord because Melkor, the rebel angel, is actually trying to write his own music, and it gets woven into the whole symphony and thus corrupts the world. But in the end, after the symphony is over, what God tells him is that you think you've done something big and bad, but really, and I'm paraphrasing here because it's beautiful the way he says it, but he says, "But thou, Melkor, wilt find that no music may be played in my despite, but he that does so will prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more glorious and wonderful than he himself has imagined." And that's like a close paraphrase, best I can do. But the point there is that God himself uses time to undo evil. And Tolkien helps us with the music metaphor added into that. What are your thoughts on that? Because I love that idea, but I'm not sure I've reflected on it fully enough. How evil itself is undone in process.
Well, I'm a huge Tolkien nerd, so I'm smiling as you're talking about the Silmarillion. I love it so much. And I do love that. And it's interesting that Lewis does that too. In The Magician's Nephew, he has a musical creation scene. But yeah, I love and really appreciate that Tolkien gave that story to us in that way, because that becomes a resource for my imagination as well. And I think it goes to that verse about he is working all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And the phrase I want to recover that I feel like we don't use a lot, we use the kind of Greek concepts like omniscience, omnipotent, omnipresent. Those are good and they're helpful. I don't know how native that language is to Scripture, but wisdom, God's wisdom, that he knows in any circumstance, he knows what to do, that he is all wise. And I think that scene with Melkor's themes being sort of his subversive themes are then counter-subversed. They're actually incorporated, and Melkor does not intend for his destructive themes to be incorporated toward the good, but it's like God just can't help doing that. That's just what he does. He can use anything. And it's not that he is causing the discord. It's not that he is instigating the evil, but that he is so wise and capable of a musician that he can incorporate anything that is thrown at him. And he can work it into even to beautify this music even more. And that's going to frustrate the evil ones, but he can do that. And so that gives me so much encouragement, because it means that through time and through music, things can develop. And this is akin to promises, going back to the Hebrew concept of history and a promise-keeping God who is all-wise and good, absolutely good and reliable. It means that whatever time I have, and whatever time I have past death even, God is capable of taking all of my screw-ups and all of my failures and all of my regrets, as well as all my hopes and all my vulnerabilities and my fears, the things that I have done wrong, the things that people have done to me, all of that big ball that's just a mess of yarn, and he can weave some kind of beautiful music, some kind of beautiful tapestry of promise and goodness that I cannot imagine how that could be possible, because it seems like, oh no, this thing has entered into the story and now the music is ruined forever. I might as well stop singing. I might as well hang up my harp on the poplars by the rivers in Babylon and let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. What's the point? And God says, no. I know you're in the worst possible place you could ever imagine, but I think there's still a song to sing. I think I can give you a new song. I think we'll keep going with this. But the time aspect too is that you can't. Begbie points this out, and I'm just pointing to him, and he says a song requires time to be what it is. If a song is 3 minutes, then a song is 3 minutes. You can't summarize it and it still be what it is. If you summarize it, it will be something other than itself. And I think human lives are that way. Music is that way. Promises are that way. Promises are like music. They take time to be what they are. And so we're seeing that across the scriptures, and who knows how we're going to see that in the future.
You told a very touching story of just a moment that you had in your life planting trees with your dad and your brother, and how this illustrates the power of time as a gift from God to give us a second chance, and the ability of our sort of foresight as image bearers of God to imagine how time is going to unfold in the future and the consequences of our choices here and now. Could you kind of tell us that story again and what it means to you in this conversation?
Yeah. So my dad is a tree farmer, pine tree farmer back in Mississippi.
So you're basically like a facsimile of Rich Mullins, because that's how his dad was a tree farmer, right?
Well, I do have a ponytail.
There you go. Okay.
My dad is a farmer. I'm from Mississippi. I think I'm fourth or fifth generation Mississippian, or maybe even fourth or fifth generation, same town in Mississippi.
That's like all the generations there are in Mississippi.
Yeah. And my dad, I've always said, is kind of a Wendell Berry character. He just doesn't know it. But one day he had decided he wanted to plant a bunch of oak trees out in this field on the property. We have a farm about 10 miles away from our house out in the country. And so he invited my brother and myself to go down and help him plant these trees. It's 200 or 300 trees. My brother is the good son, He says, "Yes, Dad, I will be there." And I was really grumpy, had some grudges against my dad. And so I said, "No, I'm not going to be there," and just because I didn't want to be there. But that morning when I woke up, I felt really burdened by that. And so I decided, okay, look, I'll go. So I drove a couple of hours and got to the farm, and we planted trees with a post hole digger. If you've ever used a post hole digger.
Oh, yes.
A few hundred times in a day. That's pretty fun.
Because you see, my friend, my dad also has a large field, and there were many posts and many trees to dig holes for. So I understand your pain.
Yeah, Dad's like, "Oh yeah, we'll have some tools to help us." And you're thinking
an auger on a tractor or something.
Right.
Yeah.
No, here, just take these 2 wooden sticks, slam this into the ground. We get there and we're planting trees, and at some point I have to run across the field to do something, and I'm about 100 yards away, and it's afternoon, and it's, kind of that golden evening time, and I look back over the field, and like you're saying, your imagination, you can kind of imagine forward, and I could just see those trees being grown, and I'm looking at my dad, but right now he's standing among these little 2-3 foot saplings. And I'm thinking, okay, when those trees are grown, my dad will not be here anymore. And I was carrying a lot of bitterness and resentment toward him just because I was a grumpy, angsty kid. But in that moment, the Lord showed me that I had a sort of, I could go one of two ways. I could hold on to that bitterness and I could lose my dad right now. Even if he was around for more years, I was going to forfeit the time that I had left to enjoy him. Or I could forgive him and things could change. And that was a very real moment where God said, you could have something different. Something can change from this point forward. And the time could develop in a very different way. Or not. You could refuse to respond and sort of waste that time that's been given to you. That was 15, 16 years ago, something like that. And it has really been different. Things have developed in my relationship with my dad that I couldn't have imagined. And and God has been really faithful in that way to fulfill that promise, to develop that invitation and that promise over time.
And that's a gift that you wouldn't have received without time. And it's kind of an abstract thought to have, but if you imagine us just as free creatures, as moral agents, making all the decisions we'll ever make in one snap decision, just in one moment of our creation. If that's how we became what we were going to become, none of this stuff would have a chance to happen, partly because we couldn't experience consequences that helped us foresee what future consequences could be. But I love the way in that account, you tied the growth of the trees with the unfolding of time. So the trees, in a way, were like a parable that your imagination could climb onto and say, oh, okay, time is going to pass. Things are going to change. My dad is not going to live forever. And every moment that I make the decision not to invest in this relationship as I should is a moment gone. That's a moment that's passed me by, but I still have more of those. So I can make a choice at this juncture. And that's, in a sense, that's what every moral decision comes down to. It's this decision to change the direction on the timeline, to make an investment in something that's going to bear fruit in a different way than it would have otherwise. And we have that chance because God makes space for us in time to experience consequences, to foresee outcomes, and to say things are going to be different from now on, or not. And that's part of the, what did you call it? You called it the hospitality of God in time. What did you mean by that?
Well, there's a line that I have loved from Henry Nouwen. He said, hospitality is when you make room in your story for someone else's story. I very much see that is what God is doing. And one of the ways he's doing that is through the medium of time. He is creating a space for us to enter into his life and to become real participants in the dance of the Trinity. But that takes time. You have to grow people, and growing people takes a lot of time. And you see that all around us in the creation, like the trees. You see the trees growing, and you think, oh, we're like that. We have to grow and mature and become fruitful, but that takes time. Time is a way that he is carving out space for us to become members of his family. And that's encouraging to me because it means we can have reasonable expectations on ourselves. Like, why am I not there yet? I want to arrive. I can see that I ought to be different. And he says, no, that's okay. It takes time. I understand that. And so we can understand that as well. And he's so patient with us and so loving and so tender as we are moving towards him in that way. And he continues to make that possible for us. So yeah, it is an act of hospitality as he invites us into his home. But he's teaching us how to live in that home too. If we were just dropped down there right now, like I'd be like, I don't know how. I'm gonna ruin everything. I don't know how to live here. And so he says, well, let me just kind of gradually show you around and get you used to this place.
I sometimes wonder if the reason that we are given an opportunity at redemption, and fallen angels are not. We were talking about Tolkien's angels a few minutes ago, is that we are processes. We are creatures of process. And I'm not saying angels don't live in time or whatever their equivalent of time is, but I am saying that angels, as far as we know, and I think Calvin even talks about this in this chapter on angels, where in the Institutes, where angels were just created as pretty much mature beings, as far as we know. As far as we know, they don't have any generation process. They're not related to each other in any sort of succession of parent to child. They're not an organism like we are as human beings. But we're creatures of process. And I wonder if part of the reason why we are redeemable in the first place is because we have that capacity to unfold and process and change over the course of time. When we when we decide to rebel against God, that's not final. It can be undone. We can be turned back. We can be regenerated and repent and change. We're not set forever in our ways. And that's mysterious. Obviously, we can't know everything there. But yeah, I wonder if that's like thank you, God, for making me a creature in time, so that when I chose to rebel, that wasn't the last word, that my sin is not the end of my story, that I can actually change because I'm still unfolding and time is still moving.
That is really good news. I mean, I love the book of Hebrews talking about Jesus being the author and the perfecter, or sometimes it's called the pioneer. He's the pioneer. But this whole idea, that there is a process that has been set in motion that does seem to be unique to humans. He has become one of us. And I have a friend who became Orthodox after college. I love the Orthodox view that Jesus was always going to become a human, even if there had been no sin.
We call that the incarnation anyway.
Yeah.
View. Yeah. I think Peter is either Peter Leithart or Jim Jordan on the Reform side of things teaches that as well. I'm fascinated by that. Yeah.
I love it. It makes so much sense because Jesus' incarnation was not a plan B or an afterthought. That was always the plan, was for the second person of the Trinity to become the thing that he had made that was the right kind of thing for himself to become. And that that was the trajectory, the destination, the predestination, if you will, was for him to become a human and then to draw humanity up into himself and to be wedded to the Godhead and to participate in the Trinity that deeply and that amazingly. But that was something that was always going to include time as an element. And that is very different from the angels. The angels, whatever they are, there's something different going on there. And Lewis talks about in the Space Trilogy how God doesn't repeat himself. He's always sort of graduating and upping the ante,
That's where Ransom realizes that if in Paralandra, where if he fails and Venus falls like Earth fell and the race of Venus falls like we fell, there will be a redemption, but it won't be like ours. It'll be like it'll be to ours as a 3-dimensional object is to a 2-dimensional object. So he said, so it would be more profound and terrible and glorious, but he's there to stop that from happening, right?
Yeah, and you're like,
from the sin from happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Well, we're at the end of our time here. I do have one last question for you, Matthew. What do you think a transformed perception of time, or just realizing its presence in our lives consciously instead of just taking it for granted, how would that change the way we live and work and play and worship? What are some distinctive changes that would happen if we took time seriously?
Well, I think if you think of time primarily as a relational medium, and I'm saying medium like paint is a medium for a painter or clay is a medium for a potter. If you think of time as what it's actually about is becoming a person, learning to become a person in relationship with others, and ultimately what time is actually for is to move closer and closer to union with God, to enter into real union with God, then that means practically I've got a lot of ordinary things to do, like I need to do laundry and brush my teeth and stuff like that. But ultimately, nothing trumps being present with people. It means that everything I do ultimately should be funneled toward that end, toward the end, the real end of humanity and the real end of time itself, which is relational, which is about learning to be a person with other people, ultimately with God. And if we have, this is another piece of language that I love, the language of affording, like, can I afford this or that? If we have, if time is a gift from God, then I can afford to spend time with the people around me. I can afford to waste time on beautiful things. I can afford to slow down and look at something beautiful for more time than I feel like I ought to, because I'm looking at my watch and my watch says, you got to get out of here. You got stuff to do. And I say, well, not really. I mean, maybe I have time to observe and respond to the charge of grandeur that I've been charged with from a creation that is charged with the grandeur of God. Maybe I can afford to spend the time reading the scripture and praying and things like that. It means that we have a resource that is not scarce and a resource that is not merely for productivity and efficiency, but it's for relationship, for growing in love.
I love that. Matthew, this has been a great conversation. Where can my listeners go to find more of your work, your music, your talks, whatever?
My website is matthewclark.net. I just released a book in May called Only the Lover Sings, which is a book and an album of songs. And that's what I'm on the road right now touring that material. So yeah, they can find all my stuff on matthewclark.net. The book is on Amazon and the album is on all the streaming platforms. And then I have a YouTube channel that you can link to from my website where there's some stuff.
Terrific. My guest today has been Matthew Clark, singer, songwriter, and storyteller from Mississippi, and a speaker at the Anselm Society's recent Imagination Redeemed conference in Colorado Springs. Matthew, thanks so much for joining me on Upstream. This was fun.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Connect with us on social media or find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.